Hello, and welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the extraordinary work of female composers and musicians throughout history. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and I created this show because these remarkable artists and their groundbreaking works deserve to be heard, studied, and celebrated. In each episode, we'll dive into the lives, music, and lasting impact of the women who helped shape the world of classical music, and today we're going to be talking about the first female conductors. And those are Josephine Amann-Weinlich and Antonia Brico. Now let me set the scene. If you've ever watched an orchestra perform, whether that's at a school concert or TV, perhaps even like something like the BBC Proms for example, or even if you've been to see an orchestra perform at a concert hall for example, you've probably noticed one figure standing at the front of the stage with their back turned to the audience. Well, that's the conductor. And if I had to guess, I bet most of the conductors you've seen throughout your life will probably have been men. And that's not inherently bad, of course, but it does raise a question of where are all the women? And perhaps even who paved the way for female conductors? And why are there so many barriers to being a female conductor in the first place? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. But before we talk about these two trailblazing women in conducting, let's just take a moment to understand why conducting was such a difficult field for women to enter in the first place. And let's even take it a step further back and talk about how women were barely allowed to play in orchestras, never mind conducting them. And for context, the first orchestra in the world to ever hire female musicians was the Queen's Hall Orchestra in London in 1913, conducted by Sir Henry Wood, which is crazy to think considering the modern orchestra began to form around the 17th century. But for much of that time up to and including the 19th century, it was a bit too taboo for women in the West to perform in orchestras at all. And that wasn't the only barrier to entry. Public concerts weren't always the safest places for women, as don't forget, this was kind of a turbulent time in history, full of revolutions and wars, and large crowds could easily turn violent, and social norms also discouraged women from appearing in such public, sometimes rowdy settings. And on top of that, history itself was often only really written by men who simply ignored or maybe even dismissed women's contributions to music altogether. So their work may have existed, but it was perhaps intentionally left out of the narrative. And the role of the conductor, well, in the early days, it actually wasn't the glamorous leadership role that we perhaps think of it today. Conducting was often shared between players of that particular ensemble, and it would usually be the keyboard player or first violinist. But as the orchestras grew, so did the prestige of conducting, and by the late 19th century, the role of conductor had become a symbol of authority, discipline, and dare I say it, masculinity, which, as you can imagine, made it much harder for women to be taken seriously on the podium. But some women broke through these barriers and managed to pull up a chair at the table. So today we're going to highlight two of the first female conductors, Josephine Amann-Weinlich and Antonia Brico. And let's dive into their musical lives and discover just how much effort and work they put into paving the way for not only the female conductors of today, but just women in classical music in general. First, let's talk about Josephine Weinlich, who was born on August 2nd, 1848, in what is now Slovakia. She was one of four daughters of Franz Weinlich, who was a ribbon manufacturer, and Josepha Hoschna. Her family story takes a dramatic turn with the Revolution of 1848, as according to one Viennese newspaper, her father, who was once a wealthy industrialist, lost his fortune, and to support his family, he pivoted dramatically, securing a concession to lead a folk singer society and a license for his daughters to perform publicly. Let's cue the stage parent allegations. Now, this change in fortune set the stage for Josephine's musical career. While it's just presumed she's learnt the basics of violin and piano from her father, details about her formal training are pretty scarce. She doesn't appear in the student lists for the Vienna Conservatory, though there were rumours she took lessons from the very renowned pianist Clara Schumann. Schumann, but it's considered unlikely she had continuous training with Schumann. But she might have taken individual lessons when Clara was perhaps touring Vienna, for example. And from 1861, the Weinlich family performances in Vienna's entertainment venues were documented in the press, and Josephine and her sisters performed regularly with their father for several years. In November 1865, a newspaper announced her last appearance with the family group, where the translation of this story suggests that this was possibly because a patron had enabled Josephine to perhaps leave the ensemble and pursue her own path. And after leaving the family band, Josephine began performing as a pianist with other singing societies in and around Vienna. But her ambition was a bit greater. Around 1867, she founded an all-female instrumental quartet, which initially performed only in private. But soon after, advertisements appeared in Vienna's daily papers, and some even under her father's name, and others under her own, seeking more female musicians. By 1868, this quartet had grown into a ladies' orchestra, making its debut in a Vienna beer hall with a unique combination of instruments: 3 violins, harmonium, piano, harp, flute, and cello. Josephine was its leader and conductor. Her sisters Caroline on flute and Elise on cello were among its early members. And the ensemble grew pretty steadily, touring to places like St. Petersburg, Leipzig, and Berlin, and expanding to 12 members by the end of 1869. On January 10th, 1870, Josephine married the music director Ibo Amann, who became the director of the orchestra, assisting with organization and recruitment. Josephine hyphened her name to Amann-Weinlich and continued to perform and tour extensively, even after having 3 children, which I'm actually surprised she didn't get them to join the orchestra as well. The orchestra's success led to a major tour of North America in 1871, where their performances in cities like New York sparked a wave of new American women's orchestras. And following disputes with their tour director, however, the group disbanded and returned to Europe separately. Undeterred though, Josephine immediately began rebuilding, forming a second, larger orchestra for another successful tour to St. Petersburg. And by 1873, her ensemble was being called the First European Ladies Orchestra, and it had grown to include 40 members, blending female musicians on strings, flutes, and percussion, with a boys' choir sometimes providing the brass section. And as the orchestra expanded, Josephine's role evolved. She transitioned from leading at the piano to becoming a full-fledged conductor with a baton, and contemporaries described her as a born conductor whose energy is evident in every gesture. She was praised for her comprehensive glance, vigorous arm, and for conducting complex scores entirely from memory. And I'll insert the photograph of the all-female orchestra here because it's truly an incredible piece of history that just makes me so happy when I see it. However, it wasn't all rosy, and her success drew misogynistic criticism. Who's surprised? Reviewers often fixated on the women's appearances, made suggestive comments, and dismissed their musical abilities, comparing them really unfavorably to male orchestras and calling their ambition a, quote, musical experiment on the field of female emancipation. One critic condescendingly noted that her energetic conducting movements contrasted sharply with the, quote, famous wave lines of the female appearance, which just deserves an eye roll, really, when you read it. Despite this, the orchestra continued to tour across Europe for several years, performing a mix of popular dance music by composers like Johann Strauss, overtures and orchestral works by Wagner and Mendelssohn, often in arrangements for their specific instrumentation. And Josephine also composed many of the pieces they performed, including polkas and waltzes. After the orchestra dissolved around 1876 due to financial troubles, Josephine founded a new group called the Sicilian Quartet, which I hope I'm saying correctly, in 1878, featuring herself on the piano. Eventually, she and her family settled in Lisbon in 1879, where she was appointed conductor of the city orchestra, which was a remarkable achievement. She later focused on teaching piano, and from 1884 to 1886 even published a bi-monthly music journal. Josephine Amann-Weinlich died from tuberculosis on January the 9th, 1887, at the young age of 38. From a folk singer's daughter to the conductor of major European orchestras, her life was a testament to her immense talent, ambition, and resilience in the world that was definitely not yet ready for a woman on the podium. But she made them ready. What an absolute powerhouse, though. I can't imagine the challenges and pushback that she faced trying to get orchestras and ensembles off the ground, and she's truly my hero. Which leads us on to my second hero, to the iconic conducting queen, Antonia Brico, who was born in Rotterdam in the Netherlands on June the 26th, 1902, and she was brought to the United States as a child and raised in California by foster parents. And it appears that from a really young age, she was determined to become a conductor. She began playing the piano when she was just 6, but it wasn't really because she had an affinity for the instrument. Her foster mother actually took her to the doctors because she had a pretty bad habit of biting her nails. And he was the one that actually recommended that she played piano in order for the little girl to stop nail biting. Which, who knew that was a medical solution, I guess? But I'm grateful that he did suggest that, because we now have a very iconic woman because of it. Now, Antonia has been quite open with and talks about that she didn't really have the happiest of childhoods and was often dragged around by her foster mother to different spiritual and religious style meetings. And one of her anecdotes of this time in her life includes a story about her and her mother going to see one of her mother's friends, I believe at one of these events, and this woman claimed that she could see the composer Liszt standing behind a very small Antonia, and the woman said Liszt kept telling her that Antonia was going to be a wonderful musician. And I mean, the story sounds absolutely crazy, but she was onto something. I mean, it turns out the ghost of Liszt actually was onto something, because he wasn't wrong, and she did turn out to be a really great musician. What's heartbreaking though is she also mentions that playing the piano for these groups of women was the only time she really experienced touch and affection from grown-ups, which actually encouraged her and made her want to play the piano more and made her want to even practice, because she knew if she did, often the women would hug her after she'd performed, or they'd let her sit on their laps while she played the piano, which just breaks my heart really that was her, I guess, reward for doing that. So she sort of attributed playing the piano with just people adoring her, which she should have been adored anyway. And it would appear that the piano was really her only relief, perhaps, from the turbulent and unhappy childhood that she was experiencing. And so she continued playing, and as music was indeed her safe space and solace, and eventually Antonia graduated from the University of California at Berkeley in 1923. And after being rejected from a conservatory that didn't accept women into its conducting program, she moved to New York to study piano with a former student of the legendary Ferruccio Busoni. Her ambition, however, remained fixed on the conductor's podium, and in 1927 she traveled to Germany to enroll in the Berlin State Academy of Music, where she became the first American to graduate from its master's class in conducting in 1929. And for 2 years, she was the only woman in a class of 60 men. Her talent was undeniable, and she made her professional debut in February 1930, conducting the renowned Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and the performance was a resounding success, earning her high praise from critics. Antonia's triumphant European debut paved the way for guest conducting engagements across the continent and in the United States, including performances with the San Francisco Symphony and at the Hollywood Bowl. In 1933, she conducted the Musicians' Symphony Orchestra at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. Yet despite these great successes, the established male-dominated orchestras of the time were not offering her a permanent position. Frustrated but undeterred, Antonia took matters into her own hands, and in 1934 she founded her own orchestra in New York City, the New York Women's Symphony. The ensemble was a success, and after 5 acclaimed seasons, it began admitting men in 1939, rebanding as the Brico Symphony Orchestra. And this orchestra continued until 1948. One of her most significant milestones came in 1938 when she became the first woman to conduct the prestigious New York Philharmonic Orchestra. A critic from the New York Sun wrote of her performance, quote, "She is no gal conductor, she is a conductor," which Duh. Still, the opportunity was a one-off performance and not the permanent role she sought. This deep-seated prejudice against female conductors was a constant barrier in her life, and in an interview, Antonia recalled a powerful manager telling her, quote, "I am booking 100 men and I can't book you because you are a woman. The public will not accept you," end quote, which is just bizarre, which is just horrible to hear when you've got such a talent and love and passion for this art form. Even famed conductor Bruno Walter told her, quote, "I feel so sorry for you. You should have been born a boy." In 1948, Antonia moved to Denver, Colorado, where she was appointed a conductor of the Denver Community Symphony, which was later named the Denver Philharmonic. And she held this position until her retirement in 1985. And during her time in Denver, she also founded the Boulder Philharmonic Orchestra and was a dedicated piano and voice teacher, counting future opera stars among her students. For nearly 3 decades, however, her international career languished as major orchestras just refused to hire her. And it's heartbreaking because she talks a lot about how devastated this made her and just how much pain she was in, because it's not as if she was a piano player, or I think she talks about being a violinist, where it's like, well, if you're not on stage you can always play the pieces at home and you can get that enjoyment through there, but her instrument was the orchestra and conducting it. And it was she talks about how heartbreaking it was for that to be pulled away from her, which she talks about with such sadness. And when you watch that, it is just horrific because she was just born at the wrong time. Like, if she was born now, perhaps she would get more opportunities. Antonia's story was brought back into the international spotlight in 1974 with the release of the Oscar-nominated documentary film Antonia, Portrait of a Woman, co-directed by one of her former piano students, Judy Collins. The film renewed interest in her career, leading to guest conducting invitations from the Mostly Mozart Festival Orchestra and the Brooklyn Philharmonia. And if you haven't watched it, I will leave a link in the description as it's available to watch on YouTube, because it touches on such a wide range of topics, not only just being a woman in classical music, but talks about like lack of diversity to sexism, and it also highlights just how determined and hard-working this woman was. And she just did not take no for an answer. And even if she saw a glimmer of an opportunity, my goodness, she worked her little baton off in order to get a seat at the table. And it's just so torturous to watch in ways, because she talks about the orchestra like you would an instrument, and how heartbroken she was when she couldn't conduct, and almost likening it to not having oxygen and trying to be able to breathe. It's probably one of the most powerful music documentaries I've ever seen, and I recommend it to anyone, whether you know anything about classical music or not. It's just a really wonderful story of a woman obsessed and devoted to her craft. Antonia unfortunately passed away in Denver on August 3rd, 1989, and her life was a powerful testament to her talent and perseverance. She proved that a woman could lead a major orchestra with skill and authority, but she also exposed the profound sexism that kept so many women off the podium for decades. As she herself said, "I do not call myself a woman conductor. I call myself a conductor who happens to be a woman." So, my thoughts. When we take a step back and look at the lives of Josephine and Antonia, what we really see is the story of classical music told from a side of history that we don't always get to see. And these were 2 women who stepped onto a stage that wasn't built for them, quite literally, and still managed to lead, innovate, and inspire in spite of every reason not to. And just think about everything we've sort of explored today. For centuries, women weren't even allowed to play in orchestras, never mind stand in front of one with a baton. Concert halls were hostile spaces, socially and politically, and the very idea of a woman leading an ensemble was mocked and dismissed, or just outright ignored. When the role of conductor became this highly respected, almost glorified symbol of power and masculinity, which of course pushed women even further to the margins because they felt like they couldn't occupy that space, or they were just told so often that don't even try and occupy the space. And yet Josephine stepped forward in the mid-19th century and created something that didn't exist, an orchestra not only led by a woman but made up entirely of women, at a time when that was unthinkable. She built ensembles from scratch, toured internationally, composed music, conducted from memory, and weathered this sort of misogyny disguised as critique. She was organizing, leading, and innovating before conducting was even considered a viable profession for women. Then you've got decades later, along comes Antonia, a woman who refused to accept to be in a world in which she couldn't conduct. And she trained with the best, stood on some of the greatest podiums in Europe and America, founded her own orchestra like Josephine when nobody would give her a job, and became the first woman to conduct the New York Philharmonic. And yet, even with all of that, she had to fight every step of the way to be seen simply as a conductor. Not a novelty, not an exception, just a musician with authority and vision and skill. And these two women might have lived in different eras and in different countries under kind of different circumstances, you could say, but what connects them is just their refusal to wait for permission. It's not lost on me that these women didn't just create the space for themselves, but for the women who came after them, the Maren Alsops, the Susanna Malkis, the Odeline de la Martinez, to name a few. So as we move forward, I think it's so important to remember the work of Josephine and Antonia, because they are the architects of the musical landscape, or the female musical landscape that we know today. And the least we can do to honor their heroic efforts to bring women onto the main stage of classical music, the least we can do is keep their stories alive and breathing. So I would just want them to be as popular as the Beethovens, the Mozarts, the Wagners, the Brahms, because had I had these stories when I was growing up in my little primary schools and music class, my God, I would have been so much more engaged, because these are the stories that, they had to battle through some shit, because every part of their story is inspiring. And that may sound cheesy, but it's the truth. And with that, I hope you enjoyed today's episode and perhaps learn a little more about these fabulous and trailblazing women. But I do encourage you to give them a little research for yourself, because there's so much to each of their stories, and especially the Antonia's documentary. It's a fascinating watch and just incredible. So yeah, definitely give it a watch. But thank you so much for listening and spending some time with me today. And if you'd like this, make sure to give us a little subscribe if you want to. And you can also give us a follow over on Instagram and TikTok, where I post lots of little stories about female composers, and you can find that at Chords and Queens. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.